In the end, it wasn't just about uncovering a secret. It was about courage, loyalty, and the bond between a man and his dog. Duke and David showed us that even in the darkest places, light can still shine. Thank you for watching this powerful story, only on Story's True Vibe. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more real, emotional stories that matter. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and keep believing in the power of truth. It was a cloudy day, and the sky seemed as sorrowful as everyone present at Hannah's funeral, who were in complete silence. Some people held handkerchiefs, while others with tear-filled eyes remembered every happy moment shared with her. The wind blew softly, rustling the leaves of the trees as if nature itself was paying its final tribute. Suddenly, an unexpected sound broke the silence. It was Duke, Hannah's loyal dog. He started barking incessantly. He wasn't just any dog. He had always been Hannah's inseparable companion. And now, there in front of everyone, Duke fixed his gaze on the casket, his barking growing louder and more insistent. People looked at each other, surprised and uneasy. "What is he seeing?" they whispered. Some seemed disturbed, pacing back and forth but unable to look away. Duke's barking only grew, as if he were trying to warn about something. Duke was a smart dog, and everyone in the village knew it. His fame went beyond the affection he inspired. He seemed to have a sensitivity that surpassed human understanding. Some children, seeing him there, began to feel a chill down their spines, remembering all those scary stories they had heard about dogs that could sense things we humans couldn't. What was Duke trying to communicate? It was clear that he knew something that unsettled even the adults. But no one dared to ask aloud. With his eyes fixed on a specific point, his behavior suggested something was wrong in that place, at that moment. Some adults began to approach Duke, trying to calm him down. However, he kept barking nonstop, his gaze locked directly on the casket. There was something in his posture, an almost palpable determination that even made the most skeptical hesitate. Curiosity filled the atmosphere, and soon, everyone wanted to understand what he was trying to say. Father Michael, standing in the front close to the casket, noticed that all eyes were now on him and the dog Duke. Trying to contain his agitation, he took a deep breath and gestured for people to settle down again, but the barking didn't stop. With a faint and uncomfortable attempt at a smile, the priest realized that something strange was unfolding, and Duke's gaze seemed to insist that no one ignore what was happening. The priest decided to approach Duke. Using a gentle voice, he tried to talk to the dog, saying, "Come on, Duke. Calm down. Everything is fine here." But even so, Duke continued to bark as if he were trying to warn of something terrible that no one could see. Cautiously, the priest extended his hand to stroke the dog's head, but Duke pulled back, letting out a low growl without taking his eyes off the casket. The priest began to sweat, wiping his forehead as he looked around, aware that everyone in the church was watching his every move. "It's just a dog," he said with a nervous laugh, trying to get people to focus back on the ceremony. But deep down, even he seemed uncomfortable, almost as if he sensed that something bigger was at play, something Duke insisted on revealing. Some people noticed that the priest avoided looking directly at the casket, as if he didn't want to see what Duke seemed to be seeing. "Does he know something?" whispered an elderly woman to her friend beside her, with a suspicious look. Others began to feel a strange chill, as if something invisible and inexplicable was present. The children, intrigued and a bit scared, moved closer to their parents, gripping their hands tightly. Father Michael, realizing that the unease was only growing, raised his voice firmly and requested, "Please, someone take the dog outside." But Duke refused to leave. He stayed there, relentless, barking and staring at the casket, as if he had an urgent message to convey. And the mystery, instead of dissipating, only grew among those at the funeral. Amidst it all, there was a man no one knew well, someone who seemed out of place, yet perfectly positioned to witness what was about to unfold. His name was David, a stranger who had recently arrived in the village, but who for some reason held a special affection for Hannah even without knowing her deeply. David had an observant nature and a restless curiosity. Solving mysteries had always been his passion, and noticing Duke's unusual behavior, he immediately felt that something was very wrong. He looked at Duke and then at the casket, realizing that the dog wasn't barking for no reason. He stood up slowly, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the dog. All eyes turned to him, curious, wondering what this mysterious man whom they barely knew would do. "Hello, little friend," murmured David, crouching beside Duke. "What are you trying to show us?" Hearing David's calm voice, Duke stopped barking. For a moment, as if assessing the man in front of him, Duke's eyes shone, filled with intelligence and a mix of fear and hope, as if he were pleading for help. David noticed the intensity of that gaze and then turned his attention in the same direction as the dog, fixing his eyes on the casket. A chill ran down his spine, as if something was pushing him to uncover what was really happening there. The people in the church began to whisper, confused and intrigued. "Leave the dog alone," said one of the men, attempting to interrupt the moment. But David just shook his head, replying, "I think Duke is trying to tell us something." He continued to stare intently at the casket and added, "And maybe we should listen." Without further hesitation, David moved even closer to Duke and said in a low tone, "Come on, boy. Show me what's bothering you." Duke wagged his tail slightly, as if he understood that David was there to help him. He then stopped barking and began to sniff the ground, taking cautious steps toward the casket, almost as if he were guiding David to a secret only he knew. As David and Duke approached the casket, the neighbors began murmuring among themselves about the legendary sixth sense of animals, recalling stories of dogs and cats that supposedly sensed presences, dangers, or even supernatural events before any human noticed. Duke's unsettling behavior left everyone on edge, and David suggested that perhaps the dog was perceiving something invisible to human eyes. The atmosphere grew heavier, and people wondered in silence, could Duke be seeing something supernatural? Or was there an even deeper mystery surrounding Hannah's death? Father Michael, clearly uncomfortable, began to realize that the situation was slipping out of control. He took a deep breath, adjusted his cassock, and cast a serious look around. With firm steps, he walked to the center of the church and raised his hands, asking for silence. "Please, everyone, calm down," he said with a voice that sought firmness but trembled slightly, revealing his nervousness. "We are here to pay our final respects to Hannah, someone so dear to all of us." The priest gave a penetrating look at David, who was still beside Duke trying to decipher what the dog wanted to show. "It is inappropriate," continued the priest, now in a louder tone, "for anyone to come here and cause a commotion at such a delicate moment." Some people in the church nodded, but others looked at the priest with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. Why did he seem so nervous? Why was he so eager to end this situation? Then the priest pointed directly at David. "What you are doing is a disrespect to Hannah," he declared in a louder and harsher tone. "Leave that dog alone and stop distracting everyone with these foolishness." David, feeling the weight of the priest's words, remained steadfast. Something about the priest's insistent manner, that exaggerated urgency to calm the situation, only heightened David's suspicions. Beside him, Duke let out a low growl, as if he too disliked the priest's tone. Realizing he was losing control, the priest insisted, almost pleading, "Please, everyone, do not allow Hannah's memory to be tarnished by this behavior. Let us return to our original purpose, to pray for her soul and her eternal peace." But for many, peace seemed farther away with each passing moment. The priest's words sounded filled with concern, but for those observing closely, the sweat on his forehead and the slight tremor in his hands told a different story. A heavy silence settled over the place, and everyone waited anxiously to see what David's next move would be. Before we continue, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you love intense and heartfelt stories. Sensing the priest's discomfort and his desperate attempt to end the conversation as quickly as possible, David decided to ask the question everyone feared to hear. With a firm voice and his gaze fixed on the priest, he asked, "Father Michael, how exactly did Hannah die?" The church went into an uproar. The murmurs grew, and some people exchanged glances, surprised at David's boldness. Father Michael's eyes widened, visibly shaken. He had already told everyone that Hannah had passed away peacefully, sleeping in her bed. But in that moment, David's question echoed through the church like a stone cast into a serene lake, creating ripples of uncertainty. "What do you mean? How did she die?" The priest replied, now in a clearly defensive tone. "I found her myself in her bed. She passed in peace, sleeping. She died in her sleep," he repeated, almost as if trying to convince himself. David, undeterred, took a step forward and continued. "But why was Hannah alone? And why were you the first to find her? Doesn't that seem a bit strange to you?" The murmur among the people grew louder. A mix of curiosity and unease spread. Throughout the church, the children, wide-eyed, watched without fully understanding what was happening, while some adults whispered among themselves, making the atmosphere even more tense. Father Michael's face turned red, and an expression of anger, barely concealed, took over his features. He stamped his foot firmly, making everyone fall silent once more. "This is absurd," he exclaimed, his voice almost a shout. "You are causing an uproar during a sacred moment, disrespecting the memory of such a beloved woman." Pointing at David with a trembling finger, he commanded, "Leave here immediately. You and that dog." His voice held authority, but there was a perceptible nervousness in every word. "We will not tolerate another word from you in this place." David hesitated for a moment. But then, beside him, Duke let out a strong bark, almost as if he were challenging the priest and giving David the push he needed to continue. As if in response to the dismissal, David realized he had touched on something important, something the priest clearly didn't want anyone to uncover. Still, he knew that in that moment, he had no other choice. He slowly turned, took hold of Duke's collar, and with one last defiant look at the priest, began to walk toward the door. As the murmurs among those present grew louder, everyone was perplexed by what had just happened. Outside the church, David felt the weight of the curious and suspicious glances of the community behind him. But he couldn't simply leave it all behind. There was something deep and dark in the mystery surrounding Hannah's death, and a strong premonition drove him to press forward. Duke seemed to share this feeling, wagging his tail with enthusiasm, as if he were ready for whatever lay ahead. "Come on, buddy," David whispered to the dog. "I think we have a lot to uncover here." And with that, they began their investigation. Through the cemetery, walking among the trees and old gravestones, the cold wind blew, making the leaves dance and producing a sound that resembled whispers in the unsettling silence. David looked around, increasingly certain that this place hid something mysterious. Duke sniffed the ground restlessly, as if searching for something specific. Guided by an almost supernatural intuition, he seemed to know exactly where to go. Determined to follow the clues, David concluded that the first step was to learn more about Hannah's life. He made his way to her house, a small stone building on the edge of the forest, surrounded by a garden that seemed forgotten by time. When he arrived, he found the door unlocked, as if someone had left in a hurry, leaving behind more questions than answers. Upon entering the house, David felt a chill run down his spine. The place was covered in dust, but he noticed that some objects seemed to have been moved recently. With Duke sniffing beside him, David began to explore every corner, opening drawers, rummaging through papers and documents. It was then that he found a small wooden box on an old table. Inside, there were letters and photographs, all yellowed with age. As he read the letters, he realized that Hannah had kept many secrets. The texts mentioned secret meetings and conversations she had with people from outside the village. But it was when he found one specific letter that his heart raced. Handwritten by Hannah, the letter mentioned Father Michael, revealing that she had discovered very serious things about him. David exchanged a glance with Duke, who seemed restless, as if sensing they were getting close to something important. Continuing his search, David found a small key taped to the back of one of the frames on the wall. "What do this key open?" he murmured to himself. Duke let out a short bark, as if encouraging David to keep going. Next to the key, there was a photograph. In it, Hannah stood beside Father Michael, with the church in the background. What caught David's attention most, however, was a detail at the bottom of the image, a small metal box identical to the one Hannah had described in her letters, mentioning that the priest hid money. "We're on the right track, Duke," David said, petting the dog. "If Hannah was trying to tell us something about the priest, maybe this key is the answer we need." David felt a wave of determination. With the small key in hand and Duke by his side, he knew the truth was closer than ever. Now, he needed to discover what the priest was hiding, and for that, he would have to search every corner of the village. "And what about you? Do you think David is doing the right thing? If you were in his place, what would you do? Leave your comment with your opinion, and don't miss the end of this story, which promises to surprise." With the key in hand, David felt closer than ever to unraveling the mystery. Together with Duke, he decided to return to the village center, where they could continue their investigation. The town seemed calm, but David sensed that something dark was hidden behind that tranquility. He needed to understand the secrets Hannah had kept, and what exactly she knew about Father Michael. With this in mind, David went to the town library, an old place filled with shelves of dusty books and ancient documents. He began to search for anything that might link Hannah and Father Michael to something out of the ordinary. After some time searching, he found an old photo album of the town. Flipping through the pages, David saw photos of community events, religious festivals, and finally, a series of photos of Hannah. One of them immediately caught his attention. It was an image of Hannah beside Father Michael. But what stood out most was the expression on her face. A look of unease, almost as if she knew something that deeply frightened her. What had Hannah discovered? She didn't look happy. She looked worried. That's when David noticed a detail that almost went unnoticed. On the edges of the photo, a small metal box. The same one he'd seen in the photograph found at Hannah's house. Driven by curiosity, David returned to her home, determined to follow the clues to the end. Back at the house, he continued his search for more evidence, and behind an old curtain, he found a hidden cabinet. Inside, he discovered a notebook, Hannah's diary. The pages were filled with notes that seemed incredibly important. David began to read quickly, with Duke by his side, as if the dog could also feel the tension building in the air. The notes revealed something dark. Hannah had uncovered a network of corruption within the church itself. She mentioned that Father Michael was embezzling money from the congregation for a sinister purpose, secretly accumulating large amounts. David read each line with a racing heart, absorbing every word. He's stealing from everyone, and using people's trust to cover up his crimes. Hannah. Among the pages of the diary, David found an envelope with more photographs. In some of them, Father Michael appeared in secret locations within the church, carrying the same small metal box. In one photo, he stood beside an old statue inside the church, the box next to him in a position that suggested he was hiding something beneath the sacred figure. A chill ran down David's spine. "So that's it," he murmured to Duke, almost to himself. "She discovered everything, and that's why she was in danger." Now David knew, he needed to find that metal box in the church. It likely held the key to understanding the entire mystery. He looked at Duke, who wagged his tail, ready for the next step, as if he knew something big was about to be revealed. "Come on, boy. We have a big secret to uncover," David said with renewed resolve. The situation was more serious than he could have imagined. With all these findings, the truth about what was really happening in that small village seemed about to surface. Holding Hannah's diary in his hands, David felt the weight of each word, each revelation, as if he were carrying a burden that could only be lifted by discovering the truth. He knew he needed to return to the church, the place where all these secrets seemed to intertwine. With Duke by his side, David walked through the narrow village streets, each step intensifying his adrenaline and determination. He was determined to find the metal box mentioned in Hannah's notes. The key to everything was there, waiting to be uncovered. Upon reaching the church, David looked around to make sure no one was following him. The place was steeped in silence, with the doors slightly ajar and the interior cloaked in shadows. He entered cautiously, accompanied by Duke, and began to explore. He remembered the photo he'd seen. The metal box was hidden beneath one of the old statues. Walking slowly, David approached a statue of a saint positioned in an isolated corner of the church. The stone figure seemed to observe everyone with a serious, almost stern gaze, as if guarding something important. David knelt, and with trembling hands, began to feel around the statue's base, searching for any sign of a hiding place. And then, he felt it. There was something there. David moved aside a small piece of fabric covering the statue's base, hidden in the shadows, and there it was, the metal box Hannah had mentioned in her diary. His heart raced, and he exchanged a look with Duke, who wagged his tail, as if to say, "We're on the right track." David held the box in his hands, feeling its cold, heavy surface carefully. He opened the lid, and what he saw inside made him catch his breath. There were bundles of money, all rolled up and tied with labels indicating donations and tithes from the congregation. But that wasn't all. Beneath the money lay a small key. He picked it up, examining it in the soft light filtering through the church windows. "A key," David murmured thoughtfully. "But what does it open?" That's when he noticed a yellowed piece of paper, folded and tucked beneath the money. Carefully, he removed it and unfolded it. It was a map, and in the center, a location was marked with a red circle. Beside the circle were the words, "Church storage." David understood immediately. The key must open some secret storage in the church. This is where Hannah must have discovered something, he thought, a mix of fear and hope building inside him. He knew he had to act quickly. With the key held firmly in his hand, he looked at Duke and said, "Let's go, boy. We need to find that storage." They stood up and began searching every corner of the church, determined to uncover the mystery that had been hidden for so long. Following the map carefully, David felt the church grow ever more silent, as if the very building were holding its breath. The map led them behind the altar, to a small wooden door, nearly invisible to the eye. A chill ran through David as he approached. The air felt colder there, laden with a dark presence, as if something sinister had been kept in that space for far too long. He inserted the key into the lock, took a deep breath, and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into a dark basement. With a flickering flashlight in his hand, David began to descend, Duke following close behind, ears perked and alert. At the bottom of the steps, they found a damp, shadowy corridor. At the end, a faint light flickered, casting uneven shadows on the stone walls. Then, a sound. The clink of chains. "Hannah?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Only the echo of his voice returned. Then he entered the room, lit by a single bulb swinging from the ceiling, and there she was. Hannah, chained to a chair. Pale. But alive. "David," she whispered, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. "Hannah!" David exclaimed, rushing forward, but before he could reach her, a heavy footstep echoed behind him. Turning around, David froze. Father Michael stood in the doorway, gripping a heavy wooden plank, his eyes blazing with fury. "You shouldn't be here!" the priest shouted, his voice twisted by rage. "I told you, you would never find her!" Before David could react, Father Michael lunged, swinging the plank. David dodged, but the blow grazed his shoulder, knocking him to the ground. He gasped, raising his hands to defend himself. How could a priest do something like this? It was inconceivable. As the priest raised the plank again, Duke barked, a sharp, furious sound, and lunged at him. With a fierce growl, Duke sank his teeth into the priest's leg. Father Michael screamed in pain, his voice echoing off the basement walls. He tried to shake the dog off, but Duke held fast, refusing to let go. In desperation, Father Michael dropped the plank and began to limp toward the stairs, trying to escape. David, fueled by adrenaline, jumped to his feet and ran after him. He can't get away. Not now. Not after everything. The truth has to come to light. With Duke still on his heels, they burst out of the church and onto the quiet village street. The commotion had already drawn a crowd, neighbors stepping outside, eyes wide, confusion on their faces. Then they saw him, Father Michael, limping, bleeding, fighting off a dog. And David, running after him. Gasps filled the air. Murmurs rose. David raised his voice. "Stop! Everyone needs to hear what really happened. This man, this priest, is not who you think he is." The townspeople froze. David, breathless but resolute, began to speak, loud and clear. "I found the metal box. Inside were your donations, stolen. Hidden away for a secret plan. I found Hannah, chained up beneath the church. He didn't want her to speak. He tried to silence her, and he nearly silenced me." All eyes turned to Father Michael, who now stood pale and trembling, no longer a holy man, but a criminal caught in the light of truth. And the truth was no longer hidden. Shock and disbelief spread across the faces of the villagers, who could barely comprehend what they were witnessing. Desperate, Father Michael tried to run, but Duke held him firmly in place until several of the village men stepped forward and helped restrain him. With the priest finally contained, David knew it was time to present the truth. He led the villagers back to the church, his hands still trembling. There, in front of everyone, he opened the metal box. Gasps filled the room as eyes widened at the sight of the embezzled donations, each bundle labeled with the names of the faithful. Then he revealed the map and the key, evidence of the priest's secret storage and hidden crimes. There were no doubts left. The truth had at last come into the light. David then led the crowd to the hidden storage room, where Hannah, still weak, still frightened, waited in chains. The relief on her face when she saw him was immediate. Duke wagged his tail joyfully, sensing his mission was almost complete. With Father Michael exposed and the truth revealed, it seemed the nightmare had ended. But evil rarely gives up so easily. As the villagers discussed what to do next, Father Michael, in a last act of desperation, seized a moment of distraction. With a twisted expression of hatred, he broke free from the hands holding him. Grabbing a splintered piece of wood from the ground, he charged toward David, his voice rising in a furious, broken shout. "You understand nothing! You should have stayed out of this!" David turned, just in time to see the priest rushing at him with the wooden plank raised. For a brief, frozen moment, he couldn't move. It was surreal, a man of God, filled with rage and violence. Then Duke leapt. With a powerful jump, the dog sank his teeth into Father Michael's leg. The priest's scream echoed through the village square. He stumbled, fell, and thrashed on the ground trying to break free, but Duke held fast. David recovered and rushed to help. He tried to pull the priest away from Duke, and they ended up struggling on the ground, a storm of shouting and barking surrounding them. With a burst of strength, Father Michael tore free from Duke's jaws and began to run, limping furiously toward the village square. But Duke was relentless. The loyal dog chased after him, barking loudly, and caught up in seconds. With another leap, he brought the priest down again, right in the middle of the square, in front of the watching villagers. Everyone stood frozen in disbelief. David, breathless but resolute, stepped forward and began to speak. He told them everything. How Hannah had uncovered the theft, how she'd been taken and hidden, how Father Michael had betrayed the very trust the community had placed in him. As he spoke, the villagers' shock deepened. Murmurs turned to silence as the truth washed over them. Then David reopened the metal box. He held it up for everyone to see, the labeled stacks of stolen money. The key. The map. One by one, pieces of the puzzle fell into place. With a solemn determination, he led the crowd back to the storage room, where they found Hannah, chained, exhausted, but alive. Gasps of horror and sorrow rippled through the crowd. And then, relief. Someone finally stepped forward and freed her. Hannah collapsed into David's arms, tears in her eyes. Duke bounded up beside her, tail wagging furiously as if to say, "You're safe now." Father Michael, now exposed, tried to justify himself, but no one wanted to hear it. The man they once revered was no longer a priest in their eyes, only a fraud cloaked in lies. The police arrived shortly after, and Father Michael was arrested, taken away in handcuffs, still muttering to himself. The villagers stood quietly, trying to process what had just happened. Hannah, her voice still weak, looked at David and whispered, "You saved me. You and Duke, you risked everything." David nodded, emotions flooding his chest. "No one should ever suffer in silence. You didn't deserve this." As the sun began to rise, casting soft, golden light over the square, the villagers gathered together. Though they were shaken, they were also united, ready to rebuild on new foundations: truth, transparency, and trust. David, Hannah, and Duke stood at the heart of it all, proof that courage, even in the darkest moments, could bring evil into the light. The secrets that had once been buried now stood exposed, and in their place, something new began to grow. United by truth, the villagers came together to transform their home into a place of honesty, healing, and hope. David, who had risked everything to uncover the truth, made a decision that surprised no one. He stayed. He chose to help Hannah recover, standing by her side as she healed not only from her wounds but from the fear that had gripped her for so long. Slowly, David became part of the community, not just as a hero, but as a friend, a neighbor, and a man with a new purpose. His courage had inspired them all, and his presence reminded everyone of the power of standing up for what's right. And as for Duke, the loyal companion who never wavered, he became a legend. Children laughed and played around him. Adults greeted him with affection. And everyone in the village knew it was Duke who had helped bring the truth into the light. He was no longer just a dog. He was a hero. Together, David, Hannah, and Duke had changed everything. Through pain and sacrifice, the village had found something far greater, a new beginning, built on truth, trust, and the strength of standing together. Thank you so much for watching the video until the end. If you were moved by the bravery of Duke and David, please don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means everything to us, and helps us bring more emotional, powerful stories like this one to life. We'll see you in the next video.